Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness echo through our lives like church bells on Sunday morning. Every parent hopes their children will remember the lessons about treating others with respect, especially when no one's watching. On a dusty train cutting through Colorado territory, Warren Pike carried his mother's wisdom in his heart, even with only $3 silver in his pocket. When he saw an elderly woman struggling with back pain, unable to find comfort on the hard wooden bench, he didn't think twice. He tipped his worn hat and offered his seat to Miss Adelaide Morrison, seeing only a fellow traveler in need. She accepted with a smile that seemed to hold a lifetime of stories. What Warren didn't know was that this humble woman owned more land than most territories. Her quiet gratitude would soon change everything for the kind-hearted cowboy. What happens when generosity meets unexpected fortune? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The train car settled into a gentle rhythm as it carved its way through the Colorado territory, wheels clicking against steel rails like a steady heartbeat. Warren Pike adjusted his position on the hard wooden floor beside the bench, his back against his worn leather satchel. He'd given up his seat without a second thought. And now he watched as Miss Adelaide Morrison finally found some relief from the pain that had been etching lines across her weathered face. She was a handsome woman, probably in her 60s, with silver hair pinned back in a simple bun beneath a plain brown bonnet. Her dress was modest but well-made, the kind a shopkeeper's wife might wear to church on Sundays. Nothing about her suggested wealth or station, just another frontier woman making her way west, same as countless others who'd taken this route before. Warren touched the small silver locket hanging beneath his shirt, a habit he'd carried since his mother's passing 3 winters ago. Margaret Pike had been the finest woman he'd ever known, raising him alone after his father died in a mining accident when Warren was barely 12. She'd worked her fingers to the bone, keeping their small ranch afloat, teaching him that a man's worth wasn't measured in the coins in his pocket, but in how he treated his fellow human beings, especially the ones who can't do nothing for you in return, she'd always said, her voice carrying that gentle authority that mothers possess. That's when you find out who you really are, son. Those words had guided him through more scrapes than he cared to count. They'd guided him when he'd lost the ranch to creditors after a harsh winter killed most of the cattle. They'd guided him when he'd worked odd jobs from Denver to Santa Fe, always sending what little he could spare to help other folks down on their luck. And they'd guided him now, sitting on this train floor, with his last $3 silver weighing heavy in his vest pocket, heading toward what he hoped might be steady work in the mining camps near Leadville. You didn't have to do that. Young man, Adelaide said softly, her voice carrying the refined accent of someone who'd received proper schooling. I could have managed. Warren tipped his hat. Yes, ma'am, I'm sure you could have. But my mother taught me that managing and being comfortable are 2 different things entirely. He smiled, the kind of genuine expression that reached his eyes. Warren Pike, at your service. Adelaide Morrison, she replied, studying his face with keen intelligence. And I do appreciate the kindness. My back isn't what it used to be, I'm afraid. The train conductor, a burly man named Fisher with graying whiskers, made his way down the aisle checking tickets. Warren noticed how Adelaide's plain leather travel bag never left her side, how she kept one gloved hand resting protectively on its worn surface. The bag looked ordinary enough, scuffed brown leather that had seen considerable use, but something in the way she guarded it suggested it held more than just a traveling woman's necessities. Tickets, please, Fisher announced, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd been working the rails for decades. Warren produced his worn ticket to Leadville, watching as Adelaide opened her bag just enough to retrieve her papers. For the briefest moment, he caught a glimpse of what lay inside. Not the simple belongings he might have expected, but neat stacks of documents tied with ribbon, what appeared to be official papers bearing wax seals, and the corner of what looked like a leather-bound ledger. She closed the bag quickly, but not before Warren noticed the quality of the items within. Too fine. Too organized for a simple frontier woman. Much obliged, Fisher said. Moving on to the next passengers, the train carried a diverse collection of travelers that autumn day. A young family with 2 small children occupied the seats across the aisle, the mother trying to keep the little ones entertained while the father dozed fitfully. Behind them, a traveling salesman sorted through his samples of patent medicines and household goods. Near the front, a stern-faced preacher read from a well-worn Bible, occasionally glancing up to frown at the card game being played by 3 rough-looking men in the back corner. Warren had learned to read people. During his years of wandering, it was a skill that kept a man alive when he didn't know where his next meal was coming from. The card players were trouble, the kind who'd pick a fight over a disputed hand just to relieve their boredom. The preacher was the sort who saw sin in a man enjoying a drink after a hard day's work. The salesman was harmless enough, probably supporting a family back east with his modest earnings, but Adelaide Morrison, she was different. She carried herself with quiet dignity, but there was something else there, a confidence that came from being accustomed to having her words carry weight. The way she'd handed her ticket to the conductor, polite but without the deference most frontier women showed to officials. The quality of her gloves, which were plain but made of fine leather. The careful way she modulated her voice, as if she was used to being listened to when she spoke. "Are you traveling far, Mr. Pike?" Adelaide asked, breaking into his observations. "Leadville, ma'am. Heard there might be work in the mines there. Been looking for something steady for a while now." Warren saw no shame in admitting his circumstances. Honest work was nothing to apologize for. "And before that? Have you always been a miner?" Warren chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. "No, ma'am. Raised cattle mostly. Had a small spread south of Denver. Lost it a few years back when the winters got too harsh and the creditors got too impatient." He shrugged. "Been taking whatever work comes along since then. Drove cattle up from Texas, worked as a deputy sheriff for a spell, even tried my hand at prospecting." Adelaide nodded thoughtfully. "You don't seem bitter about it." "Bitterness is a luxury I can't afford," Warren replied. "Besides, my mother always said that dwelling on what you've lost just keeps you from seeing what you might gain." Something in Adelaide's expression softened at that. "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." "The wisest I ever knew." Warren's hand moved unconsciously to the locket beneath his shirt. "She'd have liked you, I think. She had a good eye for quality in people." Adelaide smiled at that, and Warren noticed how it transformed her entire face. The weariness fell away, replaced by something that might have been genuine pleasure. That's quite a compliment, coming from her son. The train began to slow as it approached a water stop, and Warren stood to stretch his legs. Through the window, he could see the small station ahead, nothing more than a wooden platform and a water tower, with a handful of buildings scattered nearby. A few passengers were already gathering their belongings, preparing to disembark. "Can I fetch you anything while we're stopped, Miss Morrison? Water, perhaps? Something to eat?" Adelaide's eyes showed surprise at the offer. "That's very thoughtful, but you needn't. No trouble at all. I was planning to stretch my legs anyway." Warren touched the brim of his hat. "Besides, it's what neighbors do for each other out here." As he made his way toward the door, Warren missed the look of profound sadness that crossed Adelaide's face at his words. She watched him help an elderly passenger with his bags, saw him tip his hat to the station master's wife, observed the easy way he moved among people, treating everyone with the same courtesy, regardless of their station. When Warren returned with a tin cup of fresh water and a piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth, Adelaide accepted them gratefully. "The station master's wife insisted you have this," Warren said, settling back down on the floor. "Seems she took a shine to you when I mentioned you were traveling alone." Adelaide's throat tightened slightly. When was the last time someone had simply been kind to her without wanting something in return? When had anyone last treated her as just another person, instead of as an opportunity? "You're very thoughtful, Mr. Pike, both you and the station master's wife." Warren watched as she ate the simple cornbread with genuine appreciation. Not the forced politeness of someone unused to plain food. Another small mystery about Adelaide Morrison. She seemed equally at home with modest fare, as she was with the finer things her bag suggested she possessed. As the train pulled away from the station and settled back into its rhythmic journey, Adelaide found herself studying her unexpected companion. Warren Pike was perhaps 30 years old, with the lean build of a man who'd worked hard for everything he'd ever had. His clothes were clean but patched in places, his boots worn but well cared for. His face was honest, with laugh lines around dark brown eyes that seemed to see the good in everything around him. There was something else about him too, a quiet strength that had nothing to do with physical prowess. The way he'd given up his seat without hesitation, fetched her water and food without being asked, helped other passengers with their burdens. These weren't the actions of a man trying to impress anyone. They were simply who he was. Adelaide Morrison had spent 40 years learning to read people's true motivations, a skill that had served her well in business but had made genuine friendships nearly impossible. Everyone wanted something, a loan, an investment opportunity, a connection to her vast holdings. Even her own lawyers and business managers approached her with careful calculation, measuring every word for its potential profit. But Warren Pike had offered her his seat before he knew her name, had fetched her water and food without knowing whether she could repay the favor, was treating her with simple human kindness because that's what his mother had taught him was right. Adelaide clutched her plain leather bag a little tighter, feeling the weight of the documents inside, deeds and contracts and legal papers that represented holdings stretching from the Arkansas River to the Continental Divide, land grants and mining claims, railroad investments and cattle operations, all carefully managed and expanded over decades of shrewd dealing. She was, as Warren would eventually discover, one of the wealthiest individuals in the entire Colorado Territory. Her father, Augustus Morrison, had been a visionary who'd seen the potential in the land when it was still just empty grassland and mountain wilderness. He'd built an empire through careful investment and harder work, and he'd taught his daughter to continue his legacy. But Augustus Morrison had also taught her something else, something that had become increasingly important as the years passed and the wealth grew. The measure of our success isn't in what we accumulate, Adelaide, but in whether we remember how to be human beings while we're accumulating it. Looking at Warren Pike, kind, generous Warren Pike, with his $3 silver and his mother's wisdom, Adelaide wondered if she'd forgotten that lesson somewhere along the way. When had she stopped being Adelaide Morrison the woman and become Adelaide Morrison the business empire? When had simple human connection become so rare in her life that a stranger's courtesy could move her nearly to tears? The train continued its journey through the Colorado landscape, carrying two souls who had no idea how profoundly they were about to change each other's lives. Warren dozed fitfully against his satchel, one hand still unconsciously touching the locket that held his mother's memory. Adelaide remained awake, watching the countryside roll past while she considered the strange gift that fate had placed in her path. Neither of them noticed the way the traveling salesman kept glancing in their direction, or how he'd made careful note of Adelaide's refined speech and the quality items glimpsed in her bag. They didn't see him slip a telegram form from his jacket pocket and begin composing a message in careful script. Some kindnesses echo far beyond their original intent, creating ripples that spread outward in ways that can't be foreseen. Warren Pike's simple gesture of offering his seat was about to set in motion a chain of events that would test everything both he and Adelaide believed about trust, loyalty, and the true meaning of wealth. But for now, in the gentle rocking of the train car, there was just a cowboy and a lady sharing the quiet companionship of fellow travelers, neither knowing that their lives had already begun to intertwine in ways that would prove stronger than blood, deeper than money, and more enduring than the mountains themselves. The train's whistle pierced the morning air as they approached Cedar Junction, a modest settlement that had grown around the crossing of two rail lines. Warren could see the water tower and depot ahead, along with the usual collection of buildings that sprouted wherever the railroad decided to pause: a general store, A saloon, a boarding house, and what looked like a small bank. We'll be here about an hour, Fisher announced as he moved through the car. Engine needs some work, and we're taking on supplies. Feel free to stretch your legs, but don't wander too far. Warren stood and offered his hand to Adelaide. Care to take some air, Miss Morrison? Might do your back some good to walk around a bit. Adelaide hesitated, her hand tightening on her leather bag. Warren noticed the gesture but didn't comment. Plenty of folks were cautious about their belongings in unfamiliar places. I suppose a short walk wouldn't hurt, she said, accepting his assistance. The platform was bustling with activity as passengers disembarked and local merchants hawked their wares. Warren kept a protective eye on Adelaide as they made their way through the crowd, noting how she seemed to shrink slightly from the attention of the more boisterous travelers. They'd walked perhaps 50 yards when Warren heard Adelaide's sharp intake of breath. Following her gaze, he saw a well-dressed man emerging from the bank, tall, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. The man's eyes had found Adelaide in the crowd, and his face showed a mixture of surprise and something that might have been calculation. Miss Morrison, the man called out, moving toward them with purposeful strides. Adelaide Morrison! Good heavens, I thought it was you. Adelaide's grip on her bag tightened visibly. Mr. Whitman, she said quietly, her voice carefully neutral. My dear lady, what a pleasant surprise. Whitman's smile was broad but didn't quite reach his eyes. I had no idea you were traveling this route. Business in Denver, I assume. Or perhaps you're inspecting the new mining operations near Leadville. Warren felt Adelaide stiffen beside him at the mention of business and mining operations. These weren't the casual remarks one made to a simple frontier woman. Just traveling, Mr. Whitman, Adelaide replied evenly. I don't believe you've met my traveling companion, Mr. Pike. This is Jonathan Whitman, president of the Territorial Bank here in Cedar Junction. Warren extended his hand, noting how Whitman's attention sharpened as he took in Warren's worn clothes and weathered appearance. The banker's handshake was perfunctory, his interest clearly focused on Adelaide. Mr. Pike, Whitman said dismissively before turning back to Adelaide. Miss Morrison, I was just speaking with some associates about the railroad expansion projects. Your input would be invaluable, given your family's extensive holdings in the territory. Perhaps you have a few minutes to discuss. I'm afraid not, Adelaide cut him off smoothly. As I said, I'm simply traveling. Nothing more. Something flickered across Whitman's face. Surprise, perhaps even suspicion. Of course. But surely you've heard about the recent developments with the Denver and Rio Grande. The new spur lines they're planning. It could significantly impact property values throughout the region. Warren watched this exchange with growing puzzlement. Holdings, property values, railroad impacts. These weren't topics typically discussed with ordinary passengers. Adelaide's voice remained steady. I'm sure any developments will sort themselves out in due time. Now, if you'll excuse us, we should return to the train. But Whitman wasn't finished. Miss Morrison, I hope you don't mind me saying, but you seem different somehow. More reserved than usual. Is everything quite all right? You know that if there are any concerns about your accounts or investments, the bank is always at your service. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Warren felt the ground shift beneath his understanding of who Adelaide Morrison really was. Accounts? Investments? And what had Whitman meant about her family's extensive holdings? Adelaide's composure never wavered, but Warren could see the tension in her shoulders. Everything is fine, Mr. Whitman. Thank you for your concern. As they walked away, Warren's mind raced with questions. Behind them, he could hear Whitman speaking in low tones to another man who'd emerged from the bank. Something about telegrams and important information. Miss Morrison, Warren said quietly as they reached the edge of the platform. I couldn't help but notice. Please don't ask, Adelaide interrupted, her voice tight with strain. Not here. Not yet. Warren studied her face, seeing something there he hadn't noticed before. Fear. Not the worry of a woman traveling alone, but something deeper. The fear of someone who'd been carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear. All right, he said simply. But if there's trouble, you should know you don't have to face it alone. Adelaide's eyes showed surprise at his words. "You don't even know me, Mr. Pike, not really." "I know enough," Warren replied. "I know you accepted help graciously when your back was paining you. I know you've been nothing but courteous to every person we've encountered. And I know that whatever Mr. Whitman was talking about has you worried." They'd reached the train, but instead of boarding immediately, Adelaide turned to face him fully. For a long moment, she seemed to be weighing something in her mind. "Mr. Pike, Warren, there are things about my circumstances that I haven't shared with you. Things that might make you reconsider your kindness." Warren touched his hat brim. "With respect, ma'am, that's not how kindness works. If it depends on circumstances, then it's not kindness at all. It's just business." Something in Adelaide's expression cracked then, just slightly. "Your mother raised a good man. She raised me to judge people by what they do, not what they have," Warren said. "And from what I've seen, you're someone worth knowing, regardless of whatever else might be true." Adelaide was quiet for a long moment, watching Warren's face as if searching for some sign of deception. Finding none, she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "My father was Augustus Morrison," she said quietly. "Perhaps you've heard the name?" Warren felt the world tilt slightly. Augustus Morrison, the railroad baron, the land speculator, the man who'd built an empire across the Colorado Territory through shrewd dealing and careful investment. Warren had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. Morrison had been one of the wealthiest men west of the Mississippi when he died 5 years ago. "You're that Morrison," Warren said, understanding flooding through him. "I am." Adelaide's voice was barely above a whisper. "And I've spent the last several years trying to manage what he built while wondering if I can trust anyone who knows who I really am." The pieces began falling into place. The refined speech, the quality items in her bag, the way Whitman had spoken to her about investments and holdings. Adelaide Morrison wasn't just wealthy, she was probably one of the richest people in the entire territory. "Why tell me now?" Warren asked. Adelaide looked back toward the platform, where Whitman was still engaged in intense conversation with his associate. "Because I think that man is about to send a telegram to some very dangerous people, and because you offered to help before you knew who I was." Warren followed her gaze and saw Whitman hand a folded paper to a boy who immediately ran toward the telegraph office. "What kind of dangerous people?" "The kind who've been trying to force me to sell my holdings for half their worth," Adelaide said. "The kind who don't take no for an answer gracefully." A chill ran down Warren's spine as he began to understand the implications. Adelaide Morrison, traveling alone on a public train, had just been recognized by someone who might not have her best interests at heart. "We should get back on the train," Warren said firmly. "Yes," Adelaide agreed. "We should. But Warren, what I've told you changes things. You could walk away right now, take your seat back, and pretend you never met me. It would be the safer choice." Warren looked at this woman who owned more land than some territories, who could probably buy and sell most towns, who was asking a broke cowboy if he wanted to walk away from potential danger. He thought of his mother's words about judging character when it couldn't benefit you in return. "Miss Adelaide," he said, using her first name for the first time, "I believe I'll stay right where I am." As they boarded the train, neither of them noticed the boy returning from the telegraph office with a receipt, or the satisfied smile that crossed Jonathan Whitman's face as he watched the locomotive prepare to depart. The message was already racing along the wires toward Denver, carrying news that would set forces in motion, forces that would test everything Warren and Adelaide thought they knew about trust, loyalty, and survival. The train pulled away from Cedar Junction with a long blast of its whistle, carrying its passengers toward an uncertain future. In the modest comfort of the passenger car, a cowboy and a businesswoman sat in thoughtful silence, both wondering what they'd gotten themselves into. But some decisions once made create their own momentum. And Warren Pike had just committed himself to something far more dangerous and far more important than he could possibly imagine. The afternoon sun slanted through the train windows as Warren and Adelaide settled back into their places. She on the bench, he on the floor beside her. The comfortable silence they'd shared earlier had been replaced by something more complex, weighted with unspoken questions and newfound understanding. Warren found himself stealing glances at Adelaide, trying to reconcile this modest woman in her plain brown dress with the heiress to one of the territory's greatest fortunes. She caught him looking and offered a rueful smile. "I know what you're thinking," she said quietly. "Do you now?" Warren's tone was gentle, without judgment. "You're wondering how much of what you thought you knew about me was true." Adelaide's fingers traced the worn leather of her bag. "Whether I was playing some kind of game with you." Warren considered this carefully before responding. "Actually, I was wondering why a woman who could afford to travel in a private rail car chose to ride with the rest of us common folk." Adelaide's surprise showed clearly on her face. "That wasn't what I expected you to ask. My mother used to say that how a person chooses to live tells you more about them than what they could afford to live like," Warren explained. "You could have had your own car, your own servants, probably your own train if you wanted. But here you are, sitting on a hard bench, eating cornbread from a station master's wife." And grateful for both, Adelaide was quiet for a long moment, her hand moving to rest on something inside her dress, a small lump that Warren couldn't identify, but which seemed to comfort her. "May I tell you about my father?" she asked finally. Warren nodded, settling back against his satchel to listen. Adelaide drew out what appeared to be a gold pocket watch, its surface worn smooth by handling. She opened it carefully, revealing not a clock face, but a small photograph of a stern-looking man with kind eyes. "Augustus Morrison wasn't born wealthy," she began, her voice taking on the cadence of someone sharing a cherished memory. "He came west with nothing but a strong back and an eye for opportunity. When I was young, he used to take me with him when he inspected his properties. Not in a fancy carriage, but on horseback, sometimes camping under the stars." Warren watched as Adelaide's thumb traced the edge of the photograph. "He sounds like a good man." He was. "But more than that, he was wise about people." Adelaide looked up at Warren. "He taught me that the measure of someone's character has nothing to do with their circumstances and everything to do with how they treat others when they think no one important is watching." "Sounds like he and my mother would have gotten along fine," Warren said with a smile. Adelaide's expression grew more serious. "Before he died, he made me promise him something. He said that all the land and money in the world wouldn't mean anything if I forgot how to recognize genuine goodness in people. He was worried that wealth would make me suspicious of everyone's motives, that I'd end up alone and bitter." Warren could hear the pain in her voice. "Has it? Made you suspicious, I mean?" "More than I'd like to admit," Adelaide said honestly. "For the past 5 years, every conversation I've had, every friendship I've tried to maintain, every business dealing I've made, there's always been this question in the back of my mind. What do they really want from me?" She closed the watch and held it in both hands. "Until today. Until a broke cowboy offered me his seat without knowing who I was or what I could do for him." Warren felt heat rise in his cheeks. "That wasn't anything special, Miss Adelaide. Just common courtesy. That's exactly what makes it special," she replied. "Do you have any idea how rare common courtesy becomes when people know you're wealthy? How every kindness comes with an expectation attached?" Warren was beginning to understand the loneliness in Adelaide's eyes, the careful way she'd guarded her words and possessions. "Must be a hard way to live." "It is. Which is why I travel like this sometimes. Dressed plainly, staying in modest hotels, taking public transportation. It's the only way I can meet people who'll treat me like a human being instead of a business opportunity." The train swayed gently as it rounded a curve, and Warren caught sight of the card players in the back still engaged in their game. One of them, a lean man with cold eyes, had been glancing in their direction more frequently since they'd reboarded. "Miss Adelaide," Warren said carefully, "I don't want to worry you unnecessarily, but that fellow in the back, the one in the black vest, he's been paying us considerable attention." Adelaide followed his gaze discreetly. "You think he overheard our conversation with Mr. Whitman?" "Could be. Or could be the telegram Whitman sent is already bearing fruit." Warren's voice carried a note of concern. How many people know you're taking this route? Adelaide's face paled slightly. Very few. My business manager in Denver, my lawyer, the housekeeper at my ranch. I specifically chose this route to avoid the main lines, where I might be recognized, and yet Whitman knew you immediately, Jonathan. Whitman has been trying to convince me to invest in his bank for 3 years, Adelaide said with distaste. He's also been acting as an intermediary for some other parties who've been making offers on my land. Warren's attention sharpened. What kind of offers? The kind that aren't really offers at all, Adelaide said grimly. More like ultimatums. Sell at their price or face consequences. What sort of consequences? Adelaide hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Accidents. Mysterious problems with my cattle. Workers who suddenly decide they'd rather work elsewhere. Equipment that breaks down under suspicious circumstances. Warren felt a cold anger building in his chest. They've been threatening you? Not directly. Nothing that could be proven in court. But the message is clear enough. Adelaide's voice carried a weariness that spoke of months or years of constant pressure. They want my land, particularly the railroad grants my father secured. With those holdings, they could control transportation through half the territory. Who are they? Adelaide glanced around to make sure no one else could hear. A group of investors calling themselves the Western Development Consortium, led by a man named Bartholomew Crenshaw. He's been systematically buying up or forcing out smaller landowners throughout Colorado and Wyoming. Warren knew the name. Crenshaw had a reputation for getting what he wanted, regardless of the methods required. And you've been fighting them alone? I have good lawyers and trusted managers, but yes, essentially alone. My father had business partners he could rely on, but most of them have either died or been bought out by Crenshaw's people. Warren studied Adelaide's face, seeing the strain of carrying such a burden without support. Why haven't you just sold? Taken the money and started over somewhere else? Adelaide's grip tightened on her father's watch. Because it's not just about the money. Those lands support hundreds of families, ranchers, farmers, mine workers, railroad employees. If Crenshaw gets control, he'll drive them all out to maximize his profits. My father built something that helped people build lives. I won't be the one to tear that down. Warren felt something shift in his chest, respect, admiration, and something deeper. This woman, who could have lived in luxury anywhere in the world, was risking her safety to protect people she'd never met. That's why you travel like this, he said, understanding. To see firsthand how your decisions affect real people. Exactly. A decision made in a boardroom in Denver looks very different when you're sitting next to the families it will impact. Warren glanced back at the man in the black vest, who was now speaking quietly to his card-playing companions. Miss Adelaide, I think we need to consider the possibility that your location is already known to people who don't have your best interests at heart. Adelaide followed his gaze and nodded grimly. What do you suggest? Warren was quiet for a moment, thinking. Well, first thing is, we need to figure out how much danger we're actually in. And then we need to decide what we're going to do about it. We? Adelaide asked softly. Warren met her eyes steadily. Unless you'd rather handle this alone. Adelaide's expression softened with something that might have been relief. I haven't had a we in a very long time, Mr. Pike. Warren, he corrected gently. And it seems to me that's something we ought to remedy. The train had been climbing steadily for the past hour, winding through mountain passes where the autumn aspens painted golden streaks across the evergreen slopes. Warren had been keeping a discreet watch on the men in the back while Adelaide dozed fitfully against the window. Her father's watch clutched in her hand. It was during one of these quiet surveillance moments that fate decided to intervene in the most inconvenient way possible. The train hit a particularly rough section of track, jolting the entire car with enough force to wake every sleeping passenger. Adelaide's leather bag, which had been resting securely on her lap, tumbled to the floor. The worn clasp, probably weakened by years of careful use, chose that moment to give way completely. The bag's contents scattered across the narrow aisle, and Warren's worst fears about Adelaide's circumstances became suddenly undeniably real. Legal documents tied with red ribbons spread like fallen leaves. Land deeds bearing official seals skittered under seats. A leather-bound ledger fell open, revealing page after page of property listings, mineral rights, and financial calculations written in Adelaide's neat handwriting. But it was the scope of what Warren could see, even in those scattered papers, that made his breath catch. Property descriptions that mentioned townships he'd never heard of. Mineral rights covering thousands of acres. Railroad stock certificates in amounts that made his $3 silver seem like pocket lint. This wasn't just wealth, it was an empire. Warren immediately dropped to his hands and knees, trying to gather the papers before other passengers could get a good look. But it was too late. He could hear the whispers starting, could see heads turning in their direction. "My God," Adelaide whispered, her face pale as she knelt beside him. "Warren, I'm so sorry. I never meant for you to find out like this." Warren's hands stilled as he reached for a document that clearly showed Adelaide Morrison as the sole owner of mining operations that employed half the men in 3 counties. The numbers swam before his eyes, annual revenues that dwarfed the entire budget of most territorial governments. "Find out what exactly?" Warren's voice was quiet, but Adelaide could hear something different in it, the full extent of it. Adelaide's hands shook slightly as she tried to refold the scattered papers. "I told you my father was Augustus Morrison, but I didn't tell you that I inherited everything." All of it. Warren sat back on his heels, staring at the woman kneeling before him. "How much is everything, Adelaide?" Adelaide's throat worked as she swallowed hard. By last year's assessment, the Morrison holdings are worth approximately $2.5 million. The number hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Warren had worked hard his entire life and never seen more than $100 at one time. The ranch he'd lost to creditors had been valued at maybe $800, including the land, cattle, and buildings. Adelaide Morrison owned more wealth than he could properly comprehend. $2.5 million, Warren repeated slowly. "Warren, please understand." "Understand what?" Warren's voice was still quiet, but there was an edge to it now. "That you've been playing games with me, testing to see how the poor cowboy would react when he found out he was talking to one of the richest people in Colorado." Adelaide's eyes filled with tears. "No, it wasn't like that. It wasn't a test." "Then what was it?" Warren stood, brushing dust from his knees. Around them, other passengers were making no effort to hide their interest in the drama unfolding. "You let me buy you cornbread. You let me give you my seat. You listened to me talk about losing my ranch like it mattered, when you could probably buy a dozen ranches without noticing the expense." "It did matter," Adelaide said desperately, rising to face him. "Everything you told me mattered. Your kindness mattered. The way you treated me like a person, instead of a business opportunity, mattered more than you know." Warren looked at the scattered papers, then at Adelaide's tear-stained face. "But you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth." "I was trying to protect you," Adelaide said. "And trying to protect myself." "Warren, you have no idea what it's like to never know if someone likes you for who you are or for what you can give them. And you have no idea what it's like to offer someone help when you've got nothing to give, only to find out they never needed it in the first place." Warren's voice carried a hurt that went deeper than anger. "Did you enjoy watching me worry about whether I could afford to buy you a cup of coffee?" Adelaide's face crumpled. "Warren, please." "Miss Morrison," Warren said formally, the distance in his voice like a physical blow. "I think it would be best if you found another seat. I'm sure the conductor can arrange something more suitable for someone of your station." The words were carefully polite and absolutely devastating. Adelaide stood frozen for a moment, clutching her father's watch and the scattered remnants of her privacy, before gathering what dignity she could manage. "Of course," she said quietly. "You're absolutely right. I apologize for the deception." Warren watched her walk toward the front of the car, her shoulders straight despite the whispers that followed her progress. Fisher, the conductor, approached respectfully once he understood who she was, and within minutes Adelaide was seated in the car's only semi-private compartment. separated from the general population by a curtain that might as well have been a castle wall. Warren slumped back into his original seat, the hard wooden bench that was now his alone. He stared out the window at the passing mountains, but his mind was churning with emotions he couldn't quite sort out. Hurt, certainly. The sting of discovering that someone he'd begun to care about had been keeping such a massive secret. Embarrassment at having made such a fool of himself, worrying about a woman who could buy his concern 1,000 times over. Anger at being treated like a charity case, whether that had been Adelaide's intention or not, but underneath those easier emotions was something more complex and harder to dismiss. The memory of Adelaide's face when she'd spoken about her father. The genuine gratitude in her voice when he'd brought her water and cornbread. The fear in her eyes when she talked about the threats against her holdings. Had that all been performance? Or had he just witnessed the loneliness of someone who'd been forced to guard every truth about themselves so carefully that trust had become nearly impossible? The man in the black vest approached Warren's seat with a sympathetic expression. "Rough luck, friend," he said in a voice like gravel.
Rich folks like that.
They think ordinary people are just entertainment. Warren looked up at the man's face. Lean, weathered, with eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. "Don't reckon that's any of your concern," Warren replied evenly. The man shrugged. "Maybe not. But word is that lady's got some powerful enemies. Might be dangerous for a working man to get too close to that kind of trouble." Something in the man's tone made Warren's instincts sharpen. "Is that a warning or a threat?" "Just friendly advice." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Carter, by the way. Might want to remember that." Carter returned to his card game, leaving Warren with more questions and a growing certainty that Adelaide's fears about being followed were well-founded. The scattered papers had revealed more than just her wealth. They'd announced her presence to anyone on the train who might be interested in such information. From behind the curtain of her compartment, Warren could hear the soft sound of Adelaide crying. Despite his hurt and anger, the sound twisted something in his chest. Whatever game she might have been playing, her tears sounded real enough. Warren Pike found himself facing a choice that would define not just the rest of this journey, but the rest of his life. He could nurse his wounded pride and let Adelaide Morrison face whatever threats were coming alone. Or he could remember his mother's teachings about standing by people when they needed help. Regardless of whether his pride had been bruised in the process, the train continued its climb into the mountains, carrying its passengers toward an uncertain destination while the shadows grew longer and the stakes grew higher with each mile. Night had settled over the Colorado mountains like a heavy blanket, and the train's oil lamps cast flickering shadows throughout the passenger car. Warren had spent the better part of 3 hours staring out the window, wrestling with his conscience and losing the battle. Every time he'd nearly convinced himself that Adelaide Morrison deserved whatever trouble was coming her way. He'd remember something that complicated his anger. The genuine surprise on her face when he'd offered to help her. The way she'd eaten that simple cornbread with real appreciation. The sadness in her voice when she'd talked about not having anyone to trust. The sound of her crying had stopped an hour ago. But Warren found that the silence was somehow worse. He was pulled from his brooding by the approach of the conductor, Fisher, who looked troubled as he made his way down the aisle, checking on passengers for the night. "Mr. Pike," Fisher said quietly, pausing beside Warren's seat. "Might I have a word?" Warren nodded, and Fisher glanced around before leaning closer. "The lady in the compartment, Miss Morrison, she asked me to give you this." Fisher handed Warren a folded piece of paper. "Said it was important you read it, but only if you wanted to." Warren took the paper, but didn't unfold it immediately. "How is she?" Fisher's expression softened. "Scared, I'd say. And not just of whatever trouble might be following her. She asked me twice if you were all right, whether you had everything you needed." That information settled uncomfortably in Warren's chest. After everything that had happened, Adelaide was still worried about his comfort. Fisher continued. Also asked me to mention that she's arranged for you to have the Pullman compartment at the next stop if you want it. No charge, of course. I don't want her charity, Warren said quickly. Didn't seem like charity to me, Fisher replied thoughtfully. Seemed like someone trying to take care of a friend, even when that friend was angry with her. After Fisher moved on, Warren finally unfolded Adelaide's letter. Her handwriting was neat and precise, but he could see where tears had smudged some of the ink. Warren, I don't expect your forgiveness, but I hope you'll allow me to explain. When I was 16, my father took me to visit a mining camp where several of our workers had been injured in a collapse. I watched him talk to every family, promised to care for the wounded men and their dependents, and follow through on every word. When I asked him why he'd gone personally instead of sending a manager, he told me something I've never forgotten. Adelaide, he said, the day you start seeing numbers on a ledger instead of faces in your mind is the day you've lost your soul. I've tried to live by that principle, but somewhere along the way, I let fear make me cautious to the point of dishonesty. Not fear of losing money, but fear of losing the few genuine connections I've been fortunate enough to find. When you offered me your seat, you didn't see Adelaide Morrison, wealthy heiress. You saw a woman with a sore back who needed help. When you brought me water and cornbread, you weren't trying to curry favor or position yourself for some advantage. You were simply being kind because that's who you are. For a few hours on this train, I got to be just Adelaide. Not the Morrison fortune, not the business empire, not the target of ambitious men. Just a person talking to another person about life and loss and hope. I haven't felt that free in years. I should have trusted you with the truth from the beginning. My only excuse is that I've forgotten how to trust anyone completely, and that's a failure on my part, not yours. You asked me earlier why I don't just sell everything and start over somewhere else. I didn't tell you the whole truth then, so let me tell you now. 3 months ago, I received word that a family named Henderson, who've worked a small ranch on Morrison land for 15 years, were being forced off their property. When I investigated, I discovered that Bartholomew Crenshaw's people had been systematically targeting my smaller tenants, raising rents impossibly high, denying extensions on difficult seasons, creating conditions that would force good families to abandon their homes. The Hendersons have 4 children, Warren. The youngest is only 6 years old. When Crenshaw's men came to evict them, that little girl hid behind her mother's skirts and asked why the bad men wanted to take their home away. I realized then that this isn't just about land or money or business empires. It's about whether decent families have a place to build their lives, or whether everything gets sacrificed to the greed of men who already have more than they could spend in 10 lifetimes. I can't sell, Warren. Not because of the money, but because of the faces. The Hendersons and dozens of families like them who depend on the Morrison holdings staying in hands that care about more than profit margins. I understand why you're angry with me. I understand if you can't forgive the deception. But I needed you to know that every moment we shared, every conversation we had, every kindness you showed me, all of that was real. You may have been talking to Adelaide Morrison, the heiress, but she was responding as Adelaide the woman. And she's never been more grateful for anything in her life than she is for your friendship. Whatever happens next, please know that you've reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten, that good people still exist in this world. And that kindness given freely is the most precious gift one person can offer another. With deepest respect and gratitude, Adelaide P.S. I've drawn a map of my scattered properties and hidden it in the lining of my bag. If anything happens to me, it should help good people find their way to safety and help the right authorities understand what Crenshaw is really after. Warren read the letter twice, then sat staring at it in the lamplight. Around him, most of the passengers had settled in for the night, but the 3 card players were still awake, speaking in low voices and occasionally glancing toward Adelaide's compartment. The train began to slow, and Fisher announced they were approaching Granite Pass, a small station where they'd take on water and coal. Warren made a decision that surprised even him. He folded Adelaide's letter carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket, then made his way toward her compartment. The curtain was drawn, but he could see a faint light still burning inside. "Adelaide," he said quietly. "It's Warren." There was a moment of silence, then the sound of movement. The curtain pulled back slightly, revealing Adelaide's face. Her eyes were red from crying, but her expression was hopeful. "Did you read my letter?" she asked. Warren nodded. "I did. And I owe you an apology." Adelaide's eyes widened. "You owe me?" "Warren, I'm the one who lied to you." "You protected yourself," Warren corrected. "There's a difference. And after thinking about it, I realized that everything you showed me about who you are was true. The rest was just details." Adelaide's hand went to her throat, where Warren could see the edge of what looked like a simple gold chain. "Warren, There's something else," Warren interrupted, glancing toward the card players. "I think you're right about being followed. That man Carter has been asking questions about you, and his friends have been taking turns watching your compartment." Adelaide's face paled. "How many of them do you think there are?" "At least 3 on this train that I've spotted." "Could be more." Warren met her eyes steadily. "Adelaide, I need to ask you something important, and I need you to tell me the absolute truth. Anything. Just how dangerous is Bartholomew Crenshaw? Are we talking about a man who'll use legal pressure and business tactics, or are we talking about someone who might actually hurt people?" Adelaide's silence was answer enough, but she spoke anyway. 2 months ago, a newspaper editor in Denver started investigating Crenshaw's business practices. He was found dead in an alley, apparently killed by robbers. But his notes on the Crenshaw story had been taken, while his wallet and watch were left behind. Warren felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "And you've been fighting this man alone." "I've been trying to be careful, to work within the law, to build a case that would expose him without putting innocent people at risk." Adelaide's voice was barely a whisper. "But I'm starting to think that's not going to be enough." Warren was quiet for a moment, thinking. When he spoke again, his voice carried a resolution that surprised them both. "Well then," he said, "I guess we'd better figure out how to stay alive long enough to put a stop to him." Adelaide's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they seemed to be tears of relief. "Warren, you don't understand what you're agreeing to help with. Crenshaw has resources, connections, men who'll do anything for money. You could be killed." Warren thought of his mother's teachings, of the little Henderson girl hiding behind her mother's skirts, of Adelaide's loneliness and fear. He thought of what kind of man he wanted to be when the moment came to choose between safety and doing what was right. "Adelaide," he said firmly, "we all die of something. I'd rather it be while standing up for something worthwhile than hiding from something important." As the train pulled into Granite Pass Station, Warren, Pike and Adelaide Morrison began planning their next moves, unaware that Bartholomew Crenshaw's web was already tightening around them. The stop at Granite Pass stretched longer than expected, with the engineer reporting problems with the locomotive that would require at least 2 hours to repair. Most passengers disembarked to stretch their legs and find a hot meal in the small depot restaurant. But Warren remained alert, watching the movements of Carter and his companions. Adelaide had returned to sitting beside him, their earlier conflict resolved, but replaced by a deeper understanding of the danger they faced. As they watched their fellow passengers through the window, Warren made a decision that would change everything. "Adelaide," he said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you, something I should have mentioned before." She turned to study his face. "What is it?" Warren reached into his travel bag and withdrew something wrapped in oiled cloth. When he unfolded the material, Adelaide's breath caught. Nestled inside was a cavalry saber, its brass hilt worn smooth by use, the steel blade nicked but well maintained. "This belonged to my father," Warren said, his voice heavy with memory. "Captain James Pike, 3rd Colorado Cavalry. He carried it through more battles than I can name." Adelaide stared at the weapon, then at Warren. "Your father was military?" 20-year career. Fought in the Indian Wars, served as a territorial marshal afterward. Warren rewrapped the saber carefully. What I didn't tell you earlier is that I followed in his footsteps for a while. Enlisted when I turned 18. Served 5 years as a cavalry scout and later as a deputy marshal in Pueblo County. The information settled between them like a missing piece of a puzzle finally clicking into place. Adelaide's perception of Warren shifted dramatically as she realized she'd been traveling with someone far more capable than the simple cowboy he'd appeared to be. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" she asked. "Same reason you didn't tell me about your money, I suppose," Warren replied with a rueful smile. "Sometimes the past is more complicated than the present needs to know about." Adelaide was quiet for a moment, processing this revelation. "What made you leave law enforcement?" Warren's expression darkened. "Got tired of seeing wealthy men buy their way out of justice, while poor folks went to prison for stealing bread to feed their families. Last straw was when a railroad baron named—" He stopped abruptly. "Named what?" Adelaide pressed. Warren met her eyes. "Named Bartholomew Crenshaw had 3 homesteaders murdered for refusing to sell their land. I had evidence that would have hanged him, but my superiors ordered me to drop the investigation. Said there wasn't enough proof, but the real reason was that Crenshaw owned too many politicians." Adelaide felt the blood drain from her face. "Warren, are you telling me you've been hunting Crenshaw for years?" "Not hunting, but watching, waiting, building a case that couldn't be bought or buried." Warren's hand moved unconsciously to where his father's saber was hidden. "When you told me who was threatening you, it felt like fate had finally decided to give me another chance at him." The train whistle blew, indicating repairs were nearly complete. Through the window, Warren could see Carter and his men boarding, but their movements were more purposeful now, less like casual passengers and more like hunters closing in on their prey. "Adelaide," Warren said urgently, "we need to talk about what happens when we reach the next stop. Because I don't think we're going to make it to Leadville without a confrontation." Adelaide's hand went to her throat, where Warren could now see she wore a simple gold chain. She pulled it out, revealing a small locket that matched the one Warren wore beneath his shirt. "My mother's," she explained, seeing his surprise. "She died when I was 12, but she taught me something important before she passed. She said that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what needs to be done despite the fear." Warren nodded, understanding. "Smart woman, like yours." Adelaide's grip tightened on the locket. "Warren, if we're going to do this, if we're going to stand against Crenshaw, you need to know everything, the full scope of what we're up against." She reached into her bag and withdrew a small leather portfolio, opening it to reveal documents that made Warren's blood run cold. Newspaper clippings about mysterious deaths and disappearances. Legal papers showing how Crenshaw's consortium had systematically acquired land through intimidation and violence. A list of names, families who had been driven off their property or worse. He's not just a businessman, Warren. He's building an empire through terror, and he's been doing it for years. What he wants from me isn't just my land. It's the railroad grants that would give him control over transportation through half the territory. With that kind of power, he'd be untouchable. Warren studied the documents, his military training allowing him to quickly assess the strategic implications. "How many men does he have?" "At least 50 that we know of. Maybe more. They operate in small groups, moving from town to town, always staying just ahead of the law." Adelaide's voice was grim. "And he has allies in territorial government, federal marshals on his payroll, judges who owe him favors." "But he doesn't have everything," Warren said thoughtfully. "Or he wouldn't need to resort to having you followed on trains." "He's worried about something," Adelaide nodded. "The evidence. I've been gathering proof of his crimes for 2 years, building a case that even his bought judges couldn't ignore. But I've been careful to keep it secret, never trusting anyone with the full truth. Where is this evidence now?" Adelaide's hand went to her bag. "Some of it's with my lawyers in Denver. But the most damaging material, the documents that directly link Crenshaw to the murders, I keep with me." Warren felt a chill of understanding. "Which means, if anything happens to you, the evidence disappears and Crenshaw wins." Adelaide met his eyes steadily. "Which is why I can't let anything happen to me. Too many people are counting on justice being served." The train began to move again, pulling away from Granite Pass and climbing toward the high mountain passes. Warren could see Carter moving through the car, ostensibly checking on passengers, but actually positioning himself and his men for something. "Adelaide," Warren said quietly, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I think Carter's about to make his move, probably when we reach the next isolated stretch of track. When that happens, I need you to stay low and do exactly what I tell you." Adelaide's face paled, but her voice was steady. "What are you going to do?" Warren's hand moved to rest on his travel bag, where his father's saber waited. "What I should have done 5 years ago when Crenshaw murdered those homesteaders. What my father would have done if he'd been in my position. Warren, there are 3 of them, maybe more." "You can't fight them all," Warren smiled. And Adelaide saw something in his expression that reminded her that beneath the kind, cowboy exterior was a man trained in warfare and justice. "Adelaide," he said softly, "you hired the right man for this job, even if neither of us knew it at the time." The train continued its climb into the mountains, carrying them toward a confrontation that had been years in the making. In the growing darkness outside, the peaks loomed like silent witnesses to the justice that was finally coming for Bartholomew Crenshaw. But first, Warren Pike and Adelaide Morrison would have to survive the night. The train had been climbing steadily for an hour when it suddenly began to slow, the rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails growing sluggish. Warren felt his muscles tense as he recognized the signs. This wasn't a scheduled stop. "Engine trouble again," Fisher announced, but something in the conductor's voice didn't ring true. Warren caught the man's eye and saw fear there. Quickly masked but unmistakable, through the window, Warren could see they were approaching a remote siding in a narrow canyon, the kind of place where a train could be stopped with minimal witnesses. The perfect spot for an ambush. "Adelaide," Warren said quietly, "I need you to get to the back of the car, behind the last row of seats, now." But before Adelaide could move, the train lurched to a complete stop, with a screech of brakes that suggested this halt had nothing to do with mechanical problems. Carter was already on his feet, moving toward them with purposeful strides, his companions flanking him on either side. "Afternoon, folks," Carter said, his earlier pretense of friendliness completely abandoned. His hand rested casually on the grip of a revolver at his hip. "Seems we've got ourselves a little situation here." Warren remained seated, but shifted slightly, positioning himself between Carter and Adelaide. "What kind of situation would that be?" "The kind where a certain lady has been causing considerable trouble for some important business interests," Carter replied. "Nothing personal, you understand. Just business." It was then that Fisher approached from the front of the car. But Warren's blood ran cold when he saw that the conductor was carrying a telegram in his shaking hands. "I'm sorry." "Miss Morrison," Fisher said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They made me send word ahead. They said they'd hurt my family if I didn't cooperate." Adelaide's face went white as she reached for her bag, but Carter's voice stopped her. "I wouldn't reach for anything if I were you, Mom. In fact, why don't you just slide that bag over here real gentle-like?" It was then that Adelaide made a discovery that changed everything. As she reluctantly reached for her bag, her fingers brushed against an envelope that hadn't been there before, something that had been slipped inside during their stop at Granite Pass. With trembling hands, she opened it and found a document that made her blood turn to ice. It was a death certificate. Her death certificate, officially signed, sealed, and dated 3 days ago. According to the territorial government, Carter said with a cruel smile, Adelaide Morrison died in a tragic accident near Denver. Terrible shame. But it does mean that all her properties and holdings are now available for proper administration by the Western Development Consortium. Warren saw the paper in Adelaide's hands and felt the bottom drop out of his world. "That's impossible. She's sitting right here," Carter shrugged. "Dead woman can't own property, can't sign contracts, can't testify in court. Far as the law's concerned, whoever this lady claims to be, she ain't Adelaide Morrison. That woman's been dead for 3 days. Adelaide's voice was barely a whisper. "Bartholomew Crenshaw," Smart man, Mr. Crenshaw, realized it was easier to kill someone on paper than in person. Less messy, fewer questions. And once you're legally dead, well, it's amazing how quickly all your business arrangements can be transferred to more suitable parties. Warren felt fury building in his chest. What about her lawyers? Her business managers? People who know she's alive? Carter's smile turned even crueler. Funny you should ask. It seems like there was a terrible fire at the Denver law offices of Morrison, Whitaker and Associates yesterday. Tragic accident. All the partners killed, all the records destroyed. And her business manager, fellow named Harrison, had his own accident on the way to investigate some property disputes. Thrown from his horse, they say. Broke his neck. Adelaide made her sound like a wounded animal. These weren't just business associates. They were friends, people she'd known for years, people she'd trusted with her father's legacy. You murdered them, Warren said, his hand moving slowly toward his bag. Accidents, Carter corrected. Though I suppose it don't matter much what you call them, seeing as how you two are about to have your own unfortunate mishap. Train derailments can be terrible, dangerous things. It was then that Warren realized the full scope of Crenshaw's plan. This wasn't just theft or intimidation. It was the systematic destruction of Adelaide's entire support network, the complete erasure of her legal existence. Even if they survived this encounter, Adelaide Morrison was officially dead, which meant she had no legal standing to reclaim her properties or challenge Crenshaw's takeover. But Warren had underestimated Adelaide's resourcefulness, just as her enemies had. There's one small problem with your plan, Adelaide said, her voice growing stronger despite the tears streaming down her face. The evidence I've been gathering on Crenshaw's activities? It's not just with the lawyers who are now dead. Carter's confident expression flickered slightly. What are you talking about? Adelaide reached into her dress and withdrew a small key. My father taught me never to keep all my eggs in one basket. The most damaging evidence against Crenshaw, including documentation of the murders he ordered 5 years, and detailed records of every illegal acquisition he's made, is locked in a safety deposit box at the Colorado National Bank in Denver. So what? Carter snarled. You're dead, remember? Dead people can't access safety deposit boxes. Adelaide's smile was grim but triumphant. No, but the person I gave the second key to can. Someone who has explicit written instructions to open that box and deliver its contents to the territorial governor and the federal marshal if anything happens to me. Warren stared at Adelaide in amazement. She'd been 3 steps ahead of her enemies the entire time. Carter's face went red with rage. Who has the other key? Someone Crenshaw will never find, never buy, and never intimidate, Adelaide said firmly. Someone who's been watching and waiting for justice just as long as I have. But Carter wasn't finished. Don't matter. We'll find whoever it is. Crenshaw's got people everywhere, connections in every... Not where this person is, Adelaide interrupted. And not in the place they've hidden the evidence. Warren saw Carter's hand move toward his gun and knew the talking was over. In one fluid movement he rolled sideways, upending the bench seat and creating cover, while simultaneously reaching for his father's saber. The train car erupted into chaos as Carter's men drew their weapons, but Warren was already moving with the trained precision of a cavalry soldier. His father's blade sang through the air, and Carter's gun went flying from suddenly nerveless fingers. Adelaide, stay down, Warren shouted, pressing his attack. But the fight was just beginning, and Warren realized with cold clarity that even if they won this battle, they were up against an enemy who had already declared Adelaide legally dead and eliminated everyone who could prove otherwise. The real question was whether they could stay alive long enough to reach the safety deposit box and the evidence that could bring down Bartholomew Crenshaw once and for all, as steel clashed against steel in the narrow confines of the train car. Warren Pike and Adelaide Morrison fought not just for their lives, but for justice itself, and for the future of every honest family trying to build a life in the Colorado territory. The fight in the train car lasted less than 3 minutes, but it felt like hours to Adelaide as she watched Warren move with lethal precision. His father's cavalry saber cut through the air in practiced arcs, And within moments, Carter was on the ground, nursing a wounded arm, while his two companions found themselves staring down the razor-sharp edge of 30 years of military tradition. "Drop your weapons," Warren commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd given that order many times before. "Now!" The sound of guns hitting the floor was quickly followed by the nervous chatter of other passengers who'd been pressed against the windows during the fight. Warren kept his saber trained on the three men while Adelaide gathered their weapons. "Fisher," Warren called to the conductor, who was cowering near the front of the car. "Is the engine really disabled, or was that part of their plan?" The conductor's face was pale with terror. They made me signal the engineer to stop. Said they'd kill my wife and daughter if I didn't cooperate. "The engine's fine, Mr. Pike. We can be moving in 5 minutes." Warren nodded grimly. "Then get us moving. Fast as this old engine can manage." But even as the train began to pull away from the isolated siding, Warren knew their problems were far from over. Adelaide had been declared legally dead. Her support network had been systematically eliminated, and they were racing toward Denver with evidence that might no longer be accessible to a dead woman. As Fisher worked to restore normal speed, Adelaide examined the contents of Carter's pockets, finding a collection of items that made their situation even more dire. Telegrams detailing the locations of Crenshaw's men throughout the territory, a detailed map showing Morrison properties marked for immediate seizure, and most chilling of all, a list of other people marked for elimination, territorial officials, newspaper editors, anyone who might interfere with Crenshaw's plans. "Warren," Adelaide said quietly, showing him the list. "Look at this name." Warren's blood turned cold as he read the entry. "Marshal Robert Clayton, Denver. Eliminate before Monday hearing." "Clayton's an old friend," Warren said grimly. "Served with me in Pueblo County. He's one of the few honest lawmen left in Colorado." Adelaide felt despair settling over her like a heavy blanket. "How many good people is Crenshaw going to kill to steal my father's legacy?" Warren was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he reached into his own bag and withdrew something Adelaide hadn't seen before. A small leather portfolio secured with a brass lock. "Adelaide," he said carefully, "I need to tell you something about that safety deposit box you mentioned. You said you gave the second key to someone Crenshaw would never find." Adelaide nodded. "Someone who's been waiting for justice just as long as I have." Warren opened the portfolio, revealing documents that made Adelaide's eyes widen. Military commendations, territorial marshal credentials, and correspondence from federal officials dating back 5 years. "I've been building my own case against Crenshaw," Warren said quietly. "Not just watching and waiting, but actively gathering evidence. The homesteaders he had killed. I kept copies of all the witness statements that my superiors ordered me to destroy. The land frauds, the intimidation campaigns, the bought judges. I've been documenting everything." Adelaide stared at him in amazement. "You're the person with the second key," Warren nodded. "Your father's lawyer contacted me 6 months ago. Said you were looking for someone with experience investigating Crenshaw who couldn't be bought or intimidated. He gave me the key and told me to wait for your signal." The revelation hung between them like a bridge, suddenly spanning a chasm. Adelaide's careful preparations and Warren's patient investigation had been designed to work together from the beginning. "So my father knew," Adelaide said softly. "He planned this. He planned for you to have help when you needed it most," Warren confirmed. "He just couldn't have known it would come to this." But their moment of understanding was interrupted by a new development. Through the window, Adelaide could see riders paralleling the train's route, men on horseback pushing their mounts hard to keep pace with the locomotive. "More of Crenshaw's people?" Adelaide asked. Warren studied the riders through the glass. "Could be. Or could be that word's already spread about what happened here." Carter probably had orders to report in at regular intervals. Fisher appeared at Warren's elbow, his face grim with new worries. "Mr. Pike, we've got a problem. Just received a telegram from the station master in Silver Creek. That's our next stop. Says there's been a landslide blocking the tracks ahead. We'll have to take the old mountain route through Devil's Canyon." Warren felt ice form in his stomach. Devil's Canyon was a narrow, winding passage through the mountains with steep drops on both sides and limited visibility around the curves. It was also the perfect place for an ambush. How long to reach the canyon? Warren asked. About an hour at current speed, Fisher replied. Warren made a decision that would determine whether they lived or died. Change course. Head for Copper Ridge instead. Fisher looked confused. But sir, Copper Ridge is abandoned. Nothing there but old mining claims and empty buildings. Exactly, Warren said grimly. It's also where I cached emergency supplies 3 years ago when I was still working as a marshal. Food, weapons, ammunition, everything we'd need for a siege. Adelaide understood immediately. You're not planning to run. I'm planning to end this, Warren replied. Crenshaw's been hunting you like prey, picking off your allies one by one, controlling the battlefield. Time to change the rules. He turned to Fisher. Can you get word to Marshal Clayton in Denver? Tell him Warren Pike needs immediate federal assistance at Copper Ridge. Tell him it's about the Crenshaw investigation. Fisher nodded nervously. I'll send the telegram from our next signal stop. As the train changed course toward the abandoned mining town, Warren began planning their defense. Copper Ridge sat on a plateau overlooking 3 approach routes, with the old mining tunnels providing both shelter and escape routes if needed. More importantly, it was where Warren had hidden something that could change the entire conflict. Adelaide, he said, I need you to understand what we're walking into. Crenshaw's not going to stop with just declaring you dead on paper. He's going to send every man he has to make sure you stay dead. This could get very ugly very quickly. Adelaide's hand moved to her mother's locket, drawing strength from the memory of the woman who'd taught her about courage. Warren, those people on his elimination list, Marshal Clayton, the newspaper editors, the territorial officials, they're all in danger because of evidence I've been gathering. If I run now, if I hide, they'll die for trying to help me seek justice. Warren nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility she carried. Then we make our stand, together. The train began the steep climb toward Copper Ridge as the sun started its descent toward the western peaks. In the fading light, Adelaide could see the abandoned buildings of the mining town perched precariously on the mountainside like weathered monuments to human ambition and failure. But Warren saw something different in those empty structures. He saw fortress walls, defensive positions, and the chance to finally confront Bartholomew Crenshaw on terms that favored justice instead of corruption. As the locomotive whistled its approach to Copper Ridge, Warren Pike and Adelaide Morrison prepared for the fight of their lives, knowing that the next few hours would determine not just their own survival, but the fate of everyone who still believed that right could triumph over might. The abandoned mining town waited in the growing darkness, holding secrets and supplies that would soon be put to the ultimate test. And somewhere behind them, Bartholomew Crenshaw's army of hired killers followed like wolves scenting blood, unaware that their prey had just transformed into hunters. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through the Colorado Territory for generations to come. The train wheezed to a stop at Copper Ridge just as the last light faded from the western sky. The abandoned mining town stretched before them like a ghost from another era, weathered buildings clinging to the mountainside, empty windows staring down at the railway platform like hollow eyes. Warren helped Adelaide down from the train car, both of them carrying the weapons they'd taken from Carter and his men. Fisher had agreed to wait exactly 1 hour before departing, giving them time to retrieve Warren's cache and establish their defensive position. This way, Warren said, leading Adelaide toward what had once been the town's main street. Their footsteps echoed eerily in the thin mountain air, punctuated by the settling sounds of abandoned timber and metal. The building Warren sought was the old assay office, a sturdy stone structure built into the hillside, with walls thick enough to stop rifle bullets. Behind a false panel in the back wall, Warren found what he was looking for, a cache that represented 3 years of careful preparation. "My God," Adelaide whispered as Warren revealed the contents. Rifles, ammunition, field rations, medical supplies, and most importantly, a collection of documents in waterproof containers. The original evidence against Crenshaw, Warren explained, lifting out one of the containers. Witness statements, financial records, correspondence between Crenshaw and his hired killers. Everything my superiors ordered me to destroy when they shut down my investigation. Adelaide examined the papers by lamplight, her face growing grim as she read. This is enough to hang him 10 times over. Why haven't you used it? Because I needed proof he was still active, still committing crimes. Old evidence gets dismissed by bought judges. But if we can connect these historical crimes to his current activities, including your father's murder. Adelaide's head snapped up. My father's murder? Warren's expression was grave. Augustus Morrison didn't die of natural causes, Adelaide. I've been investigating his death for 5 years. The symptoms described by his doctor, the sudden onset, the timing right before he was supposed to testify against several territorial officials, it all points to poisoning. The revelation hit Adelaide like a physical blow. She sank onto a wooden crate, struggling to process the magnitude of Crenshaw's crimes. He killed my father to stop him from exposing the corruption, and now he's trying to steal everything your father built. Warren began loading rifles with practiced efficiency. But we're going to stop him. Tonight. Through the broken windows, they could see lights moving up the mountain road, torches and lanterns carried by riders approaching at a steady pace. Crenshaw's men had found them, just as Warren had hoped they would. How many? Adelaide asked, checking the loads in her revolver. Warren counted the lights through his field glasses. At least 20. Maybe more behind them. He turned to Adelaide with an expression that was both regretful and determined. Adelaide, I need to tell you something. I've been carrying this for 5 years, and if we don't survive tonight, it'll die with me. Adelaide looked up from the ammunition she was counting. What is it? Warren reached into his shirt and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. When he unfolded it, Adelaide gasped. It was a military decoration, a Medal of Honor, its ribbon faded, but the gold star still gleaming in the lamplight. Fort Apache, 1875, Warren said quietly. My unit was ambushed by raiders while escorting a supply convoy. I managed to hold off 50 attackers long enough for the wounded to be evacuated. Lost my horse, took 3 bullets, but saved 17 lives that day. Adelaide stared at the medal, then at Warren. Why are you showing me this now? Because when those men come up that hill, they're going to find out they're not fighting a broke cowboy and a grieving heiress. They're going to find out they're fighting a decorated war hero and the daughter of the most determined man in Colorado territory. Warren's voice carried a quiet intensity that made Adelaide's heart race. Your father taught you to judge character. Well, now you know exactly who you're standing with. The sound of hoofbeats was getting closer, and Warren could hear voices calling out orders in the darkness. He moved to the window and signaled with his lamp, 3 quick flashes, followed by 2 long ones. What was that? Adelaide asked, Morse code. Message to Marshal Clayton if he's out there. Warren checked his rifle one final time. I sent word through Fisher's telegram about federal backup. If Clayton received it and managed to get here in time, that signal tells him we're in the assay office and ready to coordinate. A single light flashed back from the ridgeline across the valley. 1 long, 2 short, 1 long. Warren's face broke into a grim smile. He made it. Clayton's got federal marshals positioned on the high ground. We're not alone in this fight. Adelaide felt a surge of hope mixed with determination. She thought of her father's teachings, of the families depending on Morrison lands, of all the good people Crenshaw had murdered or planned to murder. When she spoke, her voice was steady and strong. Then let's finish what my father started. Warren nodded, and together they took positions at the windows, ready to defend not just their own lives, but the principle that justice could still triumph over corruption in the American West. The final battle for the Morrison legacy was about to begin. The attack came at dawn, just as Warren had predicted. Crenshaw's men approached the assay office in a coordinated assault, clearly expecting to find 2 desperate fugitives cowering in an abandoned building. Instead, They found themselves caught in a crossfire between Warren and Adelaide's position and Marshal Clayton's federal agents on the surrounding ridges. The first volley of gunfire shattered the morning silence, and Warren's military training took over completely. He moved with the fluid precision of a seasoned soldier, each shot carefully aimed and devastatingly effective. Beside him, Adelaide proved that her father had taught her more than just business. She handled her rifle with the competence of someone who'd grown up on the frontier. "They're trying to flank us on the left," Adelaide called out, spotting movement among the abandoned mining equipment. Warren shifted position, his father's cavalry training evident in every movement. "Keep them pinned down. Clayton's men will handle the flanking maneuver." But the real surprise came when a new voice cut through the gunfire, a voice that made Adelaide's blood run cold. "Miss Morrison." The shout came from behind an overturned ore cart about 50 yards down the slope. "This is Bartholomew Crenshaw. I believe we need to talk." Warren's jaw tightened. After 5 years of hunting this man, his nemesis had finally shown himself. "Nothing to talk about, Crenshaw," Warren shouted back. "We've got enough evidence to hang you for murder and theft." "It's over," Crenshaw's laughter echoed off the mountainsides. "Oh, I don't think so, Marshal Pike. Yes, I know who you are. I also know that Miss Morrison is legally dead, which means any evidence she might have is inadmissible in court. And as for your old investigation, well, my friends in territorial government assure me that case was closed years ago." Adelaide felt a moment of despair, but Warren squeezed her shoulder reassuringly. "That might have been true yesterday," Warren called back. "But last night, Marshal Clayton filed federal charges against you and your consortium. Murder, conspiracy, fraud, and treason." "That's right, Crenshaw, treason. Using force and intimidation to steal territorial resources puts you in federal jurisdiction now." There was a long silence from behind the ore cart, and Adelaide could imagine Crenshaw processing this new development. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its confident edge. "Even if that's true, you'll never live to testify. I've got 30 men surrounding this building." "Actually," came a new voice from the ridgeline, "he's got about 15 left." "And they're surrounded." Marshal Clayton's voice carried the authority of federal law enforcement as he addressed the battlefield. "This is United States Marshal Robert Clayton. By order of the Territorial Governor and the Federal District Court, Bartholomew Crenshaw and all members of the Western Development Consortium are under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and fraud. Lay down your weapons and surrender peacefully." The response was immediate and violent. Crenshaw's remaining men opened fire on the federal positions, clearly choosing to fight rather than face the hangman's noose. But they were outgunned and outmaneuvered. Caught between Warren and Adelaide's defensive position and Clayton's well-positioned marksman, Warren saw his opportunity when several of Crenshaw's men broke cover, trying to rush the assay office in a desperate charge. He burst through the door with his father's cavalry saber in hand, meeting the attack head-on with the same courage that had earned him the Medal of Honor 20 years earlier. The blade sang through the mountain air as Warren fought with lethal precision. These weren't soldiers or warriors. They were hired killers who'd grown soft from years of intimidating defenseless families. Against a trained cavalry officer fighting for justice, they stood no chance. Adelaide watched from the window as Warren single-handedly turned back the charge. His movements flowing like a deadly dance, passed down through generations of military tradition. In that moment, she finally understood why her father's lawyer had chosen this man to help her. Warren Pike wasn't just a kind cowboy with a good heart. He was a weapon forged by war and tempered by justice. The battle was over within minutes. Crenshaw's hired killers lay dead or wounded among the mining equipment, while their leader found himself staring down the barrels of a dozen federal rifles. "Bartholomew Crenshaw," Marshal Clayton announced as he placed the man in shackles, "and you're under arrest for the murders of Augustus Morrison, Daniel Harrison, and 17 other documented victims. You have the right to—" "This isn't over," Crenshaw snarled, his composure finally cracking. "I have connections, influence, money. I'll buy my way out of this just like I have everything else. Warren stepped forward, his uniform torn and blooded, but his bearing still proud. Not this time. See, we didn't just gather evidence against you, Crenshaw. We gathered evidence against everyone who helped you, judges, politicians, territorial officials. Your entire network is about to come crashing down. Adelaide emerged from the assay office, carrying the leather portfolio that contained 5 years of painstaking investigation. My father spent his life building something good in this territory. You spent yours tearing it down, but the good always wins in the end, because good people never stop fighting for what's right. As the sun rose fully over the Colorado mountains, casting golden light across the scene of their victory, Warren Pike and Adelaide Morrison stood together, no longer hunter and hunted, but partners in the cause of justice. The Morrison legacy was secure, and Bartholomew Crenshaw's reign of terror was finally over. 3 months later, Warren Pike stood on the front porch of the Morrison ranch house, watching the sun set over the Colorado territory he'd helped save from corruption. The autumn air carried the sounds of honest work, cattle lowing in the distance, the ring of hammers from the new barn being built, the laughter of children playing near the creek. Adelaide emerged from the house, carrying 2 cups of coffee, moving with the easy grace of a woman who'd found peace after years of carrying impossible burdens alone. She handed Warren one of the cups and settled beside him on the porch swing her father had built decades earlier. "How many families came back this week?" Warren asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. 7 more, Adelaide replied with satisfaction. The Hendersons were so happy to return to their original ranch that little Sarah cried when she saw her old bedroom again. Mrs. Henderson said it felt like coming home after a long, terrible dream. Warren nodded, understanding the feeling. The past 3 months had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, property restorations, and rebuilding trust with families who'd been driven from their homes by Crenshaw's intimidation campaigns. Adelaide had thrown herself into the work of undoing the damage, while Warren had served as both her business partner and the territory's special investigator, rooting out the last of Crenshaw's corrupt network. "Any word on the final verdicts?" Adelaide asked. "Clayton's telegram came this afternoon. Crenshaw gets the rope, along with 6 of his lieutenants. The rest got prison sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. Warren's voice was grimly satisfied. "And the territorial officials who were taking his bribes, Governor says they'll face federal charges within the week." Adelaide was quiet for a moment, thinking of her father and how proud he'd be to see justice finally served. "Warren, there's something I need to ask you. Something I've been thinking about for weeks." Warren turned to study her face in the fading light. "What's that?" Adelaide reached into her dress pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in velvet cloth. When she unfolded it, Warren's breath caught. It was a simple gold wedding band, not the elaborate jeweled creation he might have expected from one of the territory's wealthiest women, but something plain and honest and real. "I know this might seem presumptuous," Adelaide said, her voice carrying just a hint of the nervousness she'd felt as a young woman. "But these past months working together to rebuild what was torn down, fighting for the same causes, caring for the same people, it's made me realize something important." Warren set down his coffee cup, giving Adelaide his full attention. "I spent years being lonely because I couldn't trust anyone's motives," Adelaide continued. "Everyone who approached me wanted something from the Morrison fortune or the Morrison influence. But you offered me your seat on a train before you knew who I was. You stood by me when you learned the truth and could have walked away safely. You risked your life not for money or reward, but because it was the right thing to do." She held out the simple gold band. "Warren Pike, I'm not asking you to marry Adelaide Morrison, the heiress. I'm asking if you'd consider marrying Adelaide, the woman, the person who loves watching you teach the Henderson children how to ride, who admires the way you treat every ranch hand and tenant farmer like they matter, who's never felt safer or more valued than when she's standing beside you." Warren was quiet for a long moment, and Adelaide felt her heart racing as she waited for his response. Then he smiled, the same genuine, warm expression that had first caught her attention on the train. "Adelaide, he said softly. I fell in love with you when you were just a woman with a sore back who said thank you like she meant it. Everything I learned about you after that, your courage, your principles, your determination to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, just made me love you more. He took the wedding band from her hands and slipped it onto her finger. But I'm not marrying Adelaide the woman instead of Adelaide Morrison the heiress. I'm marrying all of you, the business mind that can manage an empire, the fighter who won't back down from bullies, the gentle soul who cries over displaced families, and the partner who makes me want to be the best man I can possibly be. Adelaide's eyes filled with tears of happiness as Warren cupped her face in his hands. Besides, he said with a grin, someone's got to help you run all this land and take care of all these families. Might as well be someone who knows the difference between doing right and doing profitable. Adelaide laughed through her tears. So that's a yes. That's a yes to everything, Warren replied, leaning in to kiss her as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. To marriage, to partnership, to building something together that would make both our parents proud. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Warren and Adelaide sat together on the porch swing, planning their future and their wedding. They decided it would be a simple ceremony, held right there on the ranch. With all the families they'd helped return to their homes as their witnesses, the Morrison legacy would continue. But it would be different now. Not just one person carrying an impossible burden, but two people sharing the responsibility of caring for the land and the families who depended on it. Warren would bring his sense of justice and his understanding of ordinary working folks, while Adelaide would contribute her business acumen and her father's vision of responsible prosperity. In the distance, they could hear the sound of music drifting from the bunkhouse, where the ranch hands were celebrating another successful day of honest work under honest management. It was a sound that hadn't been heard on Morrison land for years, the sound of people who felt secure in their futures and valued for their contributions. Warren, Pike, and Adelaide. Morrison had found something rarer than gold in the Colorado Territory. They'd found each other, and in doing so, they'd found their purpose. Together, they would build a legacy based not on what they could accumulate, but on how many lives they could improve and how much good they could do in a world that desperately needed people willing to stand up for what was right. The simple gold wedding band caught the starlight as Adelaide reached for Warren's hand, and they sat together in comfortable silence. Two souls who had started as strangers on a train and had become partners in everything that mattered. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness really do echo through our lives like church bells on Sunday morning, changing everything in ways we never could have imagined.